Beautiful. Welcome to today's Local Government Education Program webinar provided by University of Illinois Extension, Prairie Rivers Network, and the Just Transition Fund. My name is Lisa Merrifield. I'm a Community and Economic Development Specialist at University of Illinois Extension, and I'm here with Amanda Pankau from Prairie Rivers Network and Emily Rhodes from the Just Transition Fund. Today, we'll be covering the recently adopted Climate Equity and Jobs Act. Our presenters will give us an overview of the legislation and some of the opportunities we can expect. Please keep your microphones muted and your videos off to limit our distractions and to maximize our bandwidth. If you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat and I will ask the questions of our speakers at the end of our presentation. Thanks so much for attending. And with that, Amanda, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa, and to the University of Illinois Extension for hosting today. And thanks to all of you for joining. As Lisa said, I'm Amanda Pankau, an Energy Campaign Coordinator at Prairie Rivers Network. So I'll be kicking us off today with a brief introduction before handing it off to our three presenters. You're going to hear today from Andrew Rehn, Water Resources Engineer with Prairie Rivers Network, Christina Krost, Policy Coordinator with Faith in Place, and finally from Scott Allen with the Citizens Utility Board. So I'm just going to give a little background about background and lay of the land of how and why the energy transition is happening around the country, and then our presenters are going to dive more into the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. So as you can see from this graph, coal is shown in yellow. The energy transition away from coal has been underway for over a decade. Since 2007, over 45% of US coal plants have closed. A similar trend is happening in Illinois with over half of our plants closing in the last decade. We're going to hear more about that Illinois transition in the past and the future a little bit later from Andrew. But broadly, this graph shows what's been happening nationwide. And interestingly, in 2020, for the first time in record in the US, renewable energy produced more electricity than both nuclear and coal. This transition away from coal is due primarily to falling natural gas prices. Other factors include coal plant age, falling renewable prices, as well as pollution and climate change concerns. So every year, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, you'll often hear this group called IEFA, they complete a power sector outlook. So basically, they're looking at this graph and predicting what's going to happen in future years. The most recent report projected that coal's share of generation market would soon fall below 20%, potentially dropping to 10% or less by 2025. The co-author of the 2021 report is quoted as saying, "This is just the start of a transition that is rapidly accelerating." So part of that is due to the falling cost of renewable energy. So this graph shows the levelized cost of electricity for different generation sources over time. So drawing your attention to the orangish yellowish line that represents solar, the cost of utility scale solar has gone from the most expensive to the least expensive way to generate electricity over the last decade. Wind, similarly, but not as drastically, has fallen in price to become the second least expensive. And the prices on this graph represent prices without subsidies or incentives. As many of you likely know, Illinois does have incentives to make solar and wind even more financially attractive in our state. Those incentives were adopted and they meant to jumpstart a new clean energy economy and workforce, kind of get ahead of the curve. And they were created by the Future Energy Jobs Act. That was legislation passed with bipartisan support in 2016. You'll often hear this law called CEJA. So broadly, very quick overview, CEJA created programs and incentives for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and also developed some solar workforce programs in Illinois, all with an overarching goal to get to 25% renewable energy by 2025. So thanks in part to CEJA, Illinois has become a leader in clean energy and clean energy jobs. By 2019, so these are pre-pandemic numbers, clean energy companies employed more than 125,000 Illinoisans. That's 2 times more than fossil fuel jobs. And I love this statistic. These clean energy jobs were growing 5 times faster than normal or regular statewide employment. And while we did see a decline in clean energy jobs due to the pandemic, if we look at the latter half of 2020, these jobs were recovering faster than other workforce sectors. So Illinois has emerged as a leader in clean energy and clean energy jobs. We are also a leader in emissions from pollution from our power sector and our cars. So since the passage of this bill, CEJA, in 2016, there's been growing political will to pass another energy bill. So many advocates that were interested in energy policy joined together as part of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. And in 2018, we started talking to people across Illinois, both about the challenges and opportunities around Illinois' clean energy future. This was a deliberate effort to get public input on energy policy, and it resulted in over 100 community conversations across the state. And it represents possibly the largest ever participatory policy effort in Illinois. The name of this, again, this is a deliberate campaign known as the Listen, Lead, Share campaign. So it's about listening to communities. It's about leading with equitable energy and climate policy. And then the final part was sharing in the benefits of the new clean energy economy. So I would say we're kind of at that last part of this campaign, the sharing part. So conversations like we're having today are about ensuring that we're educated and working together to ensure that the benefits of this new economy reach all areas of the state and that we all share in the rewards. So the bill that came from that Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition effort was known as the Clean Energy Jobs Act, and it was introduced in early 2019. And it really laid the foundation for 2 years of advocacy, discussions, and negotiations about energy policy in Illinois. Over the past 2 years, we saw several different bills introduced representing the interests of different stakeholders. I've listed some of them here. And the bill that ended up passing is known as the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. We call it CEJA. And so it represents a bill that was negotiated by different stakeholders, pulled parts from these different bills you see here, and over kind of a roller coaster of a process for those that followed it over the course of this year and even before. It was quite a roller coaster of a process, and it resulted in the passage of a bill this summer. So the bill passed in mid-September and was signed by Governor Pritzker just a couple of days after it passed on September 15th. The law made headlines nationwide, being called the most equitable energy and climate law in the nation. So we're happy to be here today to give you more details about, why it has earned that title and why it is so groundbreaking. So I'm kind of going to introduce it broadly here and then hand it over to our 3 presenters to dive in more. So we're going to hear from Andrew Rehn about how this new law tackles climate change and pollution. Christina Krost is going to talk about the renewable energy side of things for Illinois on path to 100% clean energy. And she's also going to cover the new programs that are being created to ensure that this transition is equitable and that we're building energy worthy in Illinois. And then finally, Scott Allen, the Citizens Utility Board, is going to share with us how this new law holds utilities accountable and creates new consumer protections. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Andrew.
Thanks, Amanda. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, you sound good.
Great. So the acting on climate change, really thinking about in terms of what does our energy look like in the state, and there's sort of 3 pieces there. 1 was nuclear energy, 2 is renewable energy, and 3 is our fossil fuel energy. So the bill sort of addresses this by ramping down fossil fuel energy, protecting the nuclear fleet in the midterm, and then building up our renewable fleet. One of the things it does is provide $700 million of financial assistance to support some of the nuclear fleet over the next 5 years. This is money that goes to support Byron and Dresden, and I think there's also some support in there for Braidwood as well, because they were looking forward to what might be the next nuclear plant that was going to face some financial difficulties. So these are going to keep the nuclear fleet going while we are looking to transition. It also, the big thing here for the climate was decarbonization. So various parts of the bill decarbonize our electric sector, and by 2045, we will have a carbon-free electric sector. So it starts in 2030 when all private coal and oil have to go offline. And then progressively from 2030 to 2045, it brings different parts of the gas fleet offline. First, looking at gas plants that are impacting environmental justice communities and the dirtier gas plants, and then progressively more the less dirty gas plants until in 2045, everything's offline. One notable sort of exception to all of this is municipal coal. This was sort of the sticking point or one of the big sticking points in the bill negotiations, but especially Prairie State, CWLP, and Springfield, those power plants are able to operate until 2045. There is an interim goal of reduction. At 2035, they have to meet a 45% reduction, and if they don't, they will have to close to meet that reduction by 2038. So ultimately, with a bunch of sort of if this then that's, you get 2038 as when 45% of those sites will come offline. So if you go to the next slide, just sort of the same. No, I was wrong, but yeah, do go to this slide. So one thing to note here is that the energy transition was already beginning before we got here. As Amanda noted, natural gas prices, renewables, fossil fuel or pollution concerns, these had already started driving closures in Illinois. And what you have here is a list of closures that were already announced by the companies that own these power plants or operate these power plants. And these are all coal plants that were closures announced between now and 2030. And what the bill does is sort of provide a backstop to these. If for some reason one of these closures doesn't end up happening, we know that the closures will happen by 2030. So we'll be seeing huge portions of coal go offline. Next slide. Ooh, that was new. We also have, this is just sort of another look at the decarbonization timeline. So again, you're seeing between now and 2030, those already announced coal plant closures. In 2030, we've got private coal, private oil, the dirtier plants in EJ communities, and also remaining private plants in EJ communities have to have an interim reduction. By 2035, we have all the remaining power plants in EJ communities go offline, and existing private gas plants reduce by 50%. In 2040, we have all remaining gas plants with a heat rate above 7,000 BTUs. And then lastly, in 2045, everything else goes. How are we doing this? The Illinois EPA essentially is doing this through regulation. These power plants they have to reduce their CO2 emissions to zero. That's the requirement. So that is the mechanism, is that they're no longer allowed to emit CO2, and that's how they will be closed. Next slide. So as part of this decarbonization, and when the bill was being developed, there was a real push for just transition. So thinking about these coal communities and what can be done to support those communities as we move to a new energy future that doesn't have fossil fuels. So included in the Clean Air or the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act is the Energy Community Reinvestment Act, and this includes a couple big pieces: the Energy Transition Community Grants, which is money that goes to these communities; Displaced Energy Workers Bill of Rights; and the Displaced Energy Workers Dependent Transition Scholarship, as well as the Energy Transition Workforce Commission. Additionally, there's support for building solar and energy storage at coal sites, and there are the workforce hubs that will be providing opportunities in the new clean energy workforce. Next slide. So a little bit more detail about the energy transition community grants. These are funded, oh, I didn't change that. These are funded at $40 million per year annually, not just $40 per year annually. So this is a bucket of money that is available. It's going to be distributed by the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity to eligible communities. These are communities that contain a fossil fuel, nuclear power plant, or coal mine that are expected to have reduced service in the next 6 years, or had reduced service in the last 6 years, including closure. So we're looking at permanent reductions in service or permanent closures. And in development of this policy, a lot of that was due to recognizing what happens when half of a power plant shuts down. You already see impacts in communities. And so we wanted to phrase this in a way that that support could already be coming in to replace things like property tax. Essentially, the services that property taxes provide are what these communities are really going to miss out on when power plants close. And the intent when the CEJA, the Clean Energy Jobs Act advocates were drafting this policy was to sort of replace that property tax. Ultimately, the language in the bill says grants must be used to plan for or address the economic and social impact on the community or region of a plant retirement or transition. This is a bit broader language, and it's going to be, I think, up to DCEO to interpret how that ends up playing out, and we'll be sort of we'll be seeing that as things go along. I saw that at least somebody from DCEO is listening right now, and so maybe they know more than I do. But this is sort of how the program is written in the statute. Additionally, there is support for Zion in the Energy Transition Community Grants explicitly written in. So Zion is a site in northern Illinois where there is a power plant that closed a long time ago and it still stores nuclear waste. They're in this bill guaranteed essentially 14 million of this 40 million pot annually, less support that comes from the bill also allows taxing of stored nuclear waste in a new way that will essentially allow them to get more tax revenue out of that site that has the nuclear waste stored at it. So 14 million less that, and also less any federal payments. This sort of was priced at there's a federal bill called the Stranded Act that hasn't passed, but if that does pass, it will essentially be giving payments at up to $15 per kilogram of stored nuclear waste, which is how we get to this 14 million number. So that's baked into the bill for Zion, and we'll see sort of what that price tag ends up being and how much of the funding budget it ends up using. Next slide. So Displaced Energy Workers Bill of Rights. These are various support services that DCO is going to be providing to the energy workers that work at power plants, coal mines, nuclear plants, anyone that might be closing. So we've got 2 years of advance notice of power plant or mine closure, so the workers will be notified. Information provided to them about where they might be able to find other employment, connection to programs that already exist that help support other opportunities for employment, financial planning services, so that these workers are able to sort of think forward, help support them in thinking forward about how they might want to plan for the future. Additionally, the Displaced Energy Worker Dependent Scholarship, it provides up to 1 year of 1 year scholarship for the children of displaced energy workers. Next slide. So lastly, there is the coal to solar program. And so this is essentially going to be allowing the build out of solar and energy storage at former coal plants. These are, for the solar energy side of things, they're incentivized through renewable energy credits, which is sort of how we incentivize solar build out in general. They have a fixed price on these RECs at $30, which is this gets beyond my understanding of how all this stuff works, but this is the price that was negotiated essentially to create enough incentive for the power companies to be building solar on the property. They build it on the property. They can also build it off the property onto adjacent properties if they need to to sort of make a project large enough to make it pencil out. And there are sort of prevailing wage requirements on actually both the solar and the energy storage components here. So the labor that goes into this, there are some requirements around you know, what that prevailing wage and peace agreements and sort of other labor protection agreements. Energy storage, this is a fixed number of sites. There's going to be 3 in MISO and two in PJM. For those who don't know, MISO and PJM are sort of parts of the grid. PJM is generally Northern Illinois and MISO is generally Southern Illinois. You could look up a map online to see where that line is drawn. But so we'll also be looking at 5 power plants that have some sort of storage project. And this program is either not both, so they're going to be getting incentivized. One of these 2 at each site is going to be what they get incentivized. They might still build solar near the energy storage, but it won't have the same incentives available to it. Next slide. So lastly, on sort of the decarbonization side of things, outside of the electric sector, the bill also addresses transportation. And the goal being 1 million electric vehicles by 2030 in Illinois. Couple things that are included in the bill. First, a $4,000 per vehicle rebate for electric vehicles. This one is sort of up in the air policy-wise. I don't think it's available statewide yet, but the intent is to make that a thing. And I'm not exactly sure where that landed, as it was sort of maybe a bit of a question mark after the policy came out. And I think they were maybe going to address it in veto session. But there's that rebate, which will hopefully eventually be available statewide. Also rebates to cover the cost of constructing charging stations. So this is both rebates, I think, are available to individuals who might be constructing charging stations, but also sort of the larger scale charging stations. The Illinois EPA is going to be having an EV coordinator because there's a lot of money that was recently made available, both through our capital bill and the VW settlements. So the state sued Volkswagen a couple of years ago, and there's this big pot of money. And this coordinator will be sort of looking to see how that can be implemented in a way that will help build out EVs. And lastly, there are the utilities are required to develop beneficial electrification plans that will help with electrification and manage the grid impacts from charging. So with that, I think that's my last slide. So I'll pass it off to Christina.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. Everybody can hear me okay? I hope.
Yes, I'm good.
Great. So I will get started then talking about how renewable energy fits into this. So, you know, as you can see, we're going to be transitioning away from some energy sources, but we couldn't stop that tomorrow. We need to have these renewable energy sources built and created and online and ready to go, you know, to help create that energy for our state, right? So when CEJA was passed in 2016, there was hope that we'd be able to scale up really quickly and get a lot of this solar built. And so if you look at this graph kind of here, you know, it kind of started moving in a good direction, and then it kind of hit what we call a solar cliff. And so CEJA was passed to kind of help, you know, one of the things it does is help fix that cliff, right? To help get more of that renewable energy built and online quickly to meet our targets. So these targets are, you know, we want to have 40% more renewables built by 2030 and be 40% of our portfolio be renewable by 2030 and then 50 by 2040. We are sitting below 10 right now. So we have some work to do, but that of course means jobs, right? So it also creates some new categories for renewables, solar on our schools, some more community-driven community solar. So not just community solar and calling it community solar, actual, you know, communities have a lot more input in this kind of community solar. And then projects that are led by BIPOC contractors, because much of the work that is done is not by those who are training to get into this group of contractors. It is not people who traditionally have benefited from these projects. We want again, the whole point of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act is that the jobs, the benefits of this new green energy economy is felt across the board, across lots of different regions and races and groups of people and economics. We want this to be, good for everyone. You can go to the next slide. So some of you might be familiar with the Solar for All program. So that's part of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. Solar for All was created with CEJA in 2016. But so Solar for All was an attempt to let folks who wouldn't traditionally be able to access solar energy at their homes or their nonprofits be able to do that for low or no cost up front. And so CEJA increases the Solar for All funding to $50 million a year, coordinates projects with training and efficiency programs, again, getting that workforce that we're training up to do these jobs, having jobs to actually work on is a really important point, because you can train all the workers that you want, but if there's not actual jobs for them to do, it's all for naught. And ensuring that small and emerging businesses can access these projects. So making sure that new businesses, sometimes BIPOC, businesses will be able to bid on these projects and be able to build these projects so that everyone, again, is benefiting from this, not just, the big contractors that always get the projects. Next slide. So something really exciting about this is the carbon-free school and community-driven solar initiatives that are part of, again, building up our renewable energy. So we want to try to get our public schools to be carbon-free, with special attention being paid to those that are in environmental justice communities, low-income communities. This seems like a really easy thing, right? You've got a school building with a lot of roof. Why don't we put solar on it? And make that air a little bit cleaner, make those kids breathe a little bit easier, right, in these communities, and save some school districts a bunch of money. So that's a really exciting thing. And then bring jobs to building those projects out on those schools. And then community-driven community solar. Again, community solar is often a situation where a company comes in and decides to build something in a community, and then people subscribe to it. And sometimes that community doesn't know about that project, doesn't want that project in that community. And so a community-driven community solar project would be one which the community wants this project and advocates for this project, and then those benefits stay in that community. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the part of the bill, I think, that hits a lot of people's lives very personally. So I'm a mom, and I'm a person of faith, and I am a former elementary school teacher. So what I know about policy and what I know about this policy in particular kind of comes from a lens of, I'm not someone who went to school to learn how all of this works. I learn as I go, right? So I'm a community member just like you. And I grew up in the Detroit suburbs. Certainly my whole life was intertwined with the automotive industry. My husband's job was intertwined with the automotive industry. And when that industry, tanked in 2008, 2009, that affected my family deeply. My husband lost his job. We lost a home. My neighborhood emptied overnight because people didn't have their jobs anymore. Our house lost half of its value overnight. And so when we talk about an equitable workforce, when we talk about making sure that there is a just transition, I think a lot of us deeply understand that these are real people that we're talking about here, that this is real life and very important that people have access to job training, have access to some funding to make their communities work while they're figuring out what happens once this plant has gone away or the coal mine has gone away. This is real life. These are real people. And so that was absolutely at the heart of why this bill was written, why this bill was taken all around the state to get input from communities. And so where we've landed here is with equity in our clean energy workforce, with this workforce hub or network program, where there will be 13 hubs around the state located very close to or literally right on top of communities that we know will have a transition. They were losing a coal mine, they were losing a coal plant. And so those folks will have access to workforce training. There'll also be contractor incubators throughout the state. So again, we can train all of this, workers that we want, but if there's not companies for them to go to and jobs for them to build, there's not much benefit there, right? So we are, at the same time as we train up our workforce, we are trying to create this contractor program where we get people up to speed on being able to build out all these renewable energy programs. We also are projects. We have planned energy transition navigators to help people through this process, because if anyone's ever transitioned from a job, they will know that is not an easy process. And we want to reduce any barriers that we can to people trying to get into this this new green energy economy. We want it available to everyone. Again, we want this to be an equitable way for our state to benefit. Let's go to the next slide. So again, more parts from this, equity in the workforce program. We have a primes contractor accelerator, again, getting these businesses up to speed. We want returning residents. Those would be people who have been involved in the justice system to be able to train for these kinds of jobs, so that once they leave prison and return to their communities, that they have a job to be able to do to help themselves, return into this community and stay in their community and give back to their community, right? And then funding and seed capital. Again, if you're starting a new business, you need funding and seed capital. And there are lots of places in the state of Illinois where you've been disadvantaged and have not been able to access this kind of funding to get a business underway. So again, this is a way for us to level that field, get more people involved in this economy. So jobs and environmental justice grant programs, Clean Energy Jobs Justice Fund, so what we're calling a green bank for BIPOC contractors to be able to access funds so that they can get their jobs up and running, or so that they can be paid for jobs and then do the jobs and not have to be fronting money all the time. And the Illinois Finance Authority Climate Bank, which I'm not entirely sure what that is. I think it's related to the Green Bank though. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in the bill, it defines what an equity eligible community or a person or a contractor is defined as. And there will be accountability systems. Now, this is a nation leading provision in the bill that we are actually going to make sure that there's diversity in our hiring, sorry, that's my dog. I had a feeling that was going to happen. That there's going to be diversity in our job work, in our workforce here that's being trained. And then we will get reports on the equity goals. We will be doing audits to make sure that we're hitting these equity provisions. Again, we want all Illinoisans to be able to benefit from this. Also, that these jobs will be getting prevailing wage. You can see this, the points here, but we want everybody to be able to be making a living wage to do this work, right? Prevailing wage. But if you are a new contractor and you are just getting started, that can be really difficult to be able to provide your workers with that. So we wanted to make sure that there are provisions in here as well, so that even new businesses that are just getting started are able to provide their workers with prevailing wage and still be able to do these jobs. I think we can go to the next slide. So, we talk a lot about solar, we talk a lot about wind, and those are very exciting parts of the green economy. They're very exciting job possibilities and opportunities, and just, so much opportunity is available through that. But sometimes we forget that energy efficiency is still part of this, and that energy efficiency is also a green form of energy. The energy you don't have to create is green, it's part of the portfolio. And so the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act has provisions here to extend energy efficiency goals, to create some health and safety funding. So oftentimes, if you're a low-income customer who wants to do an efficiency program at your home, but you've got a a problem and that needs to be fixed. And these contractors can't come in and do the efficiency program until something else is fixed. You've got a leak, you've got a roof leak, you've got, a problem. There's some funding here to fix some of those problems so that you can then go ahead and complete the efficiency project. Weatherization, again, very low cost, but very effective energy efficiency programs. Establishes an equitable energy upgrade program, again, making sure that all people can access this, and that it establishes stretch energy codes as well in building. And let's go to the next slide. I think this is my last slide. So, what's next here with these parts of the bill? Well, so you just passed. Now it needs to be implemented, and we need to get that money into our communities, right? So town halls like this, informing people of the changes that are coming and how this can benefit your community. We can be bringing town halls like this to your communities all over the state, and doing more, like Amanda had mentioned earlier, listen, lead, share events, talking about, what's the bill? How will it benefit our community? Let's share the success. Let's share some ideas. Let's get something generated and make this happen. And you may have mentioned or may have noticed some of the federal work that's happening right now. So this is a great time for Illinois to be leading on climate because our country is moving in that direction as well. And so there will be funding available to do a lot of these projects that we want to do at the federal level as well. And so, people will be replacing lead service lines, for example. That will be a project that will take decades and will require a lot of workers. And then hopefully with the Build Back Better plan, if that is passed in the coming weeks, that's even more funding for these kinds of projects. So I think with that, we go to Scott Allen to talk about some of the utility reforms.
Thank you, Christina, and good morning, everybody. So yeah, just a quick bit on CUB for anybody who's unfamiliar. We were established by the Illinois General Assembly in the early 80s, and we're consumer advocates at the Illinois Commerce Commission, the courts, and General Assembly for ratepayers of the investor-owned utilities. And CUB got involved in this work because there were huge opportunities to make improvements for consumer protections and the way that the utilities are allowed to do business, and because it's in the CUB Act that we're responsible for overseeing the health and safety of consumers also. So we're not that strange a fit for all of this. Next slide, please. So utility accountability piece, things really took a turn when the ComEd public corruption scandal started rolling out, and it became pretty clear that consumer advocates and people who wanted to strengthen consumer protections and kind of rein the utilities in a little bit, when that all folded out and ComEd entered a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. prosecutor. So at that point, not just the advocates of this bill, but lawmakers also wanted to really tighten down on how we hold utilities accountable. And kind of at the top of that list is replacing formula rate making with a performance-based rate making. And that's kind of a complicated thing that maybe we don't have time to get into here, but instead of incentivizing the utilities to spend a lot of money on things that it's not exactly transparent how that money is being spent, we would switch that around and incentivize the utilities to, if they want to earn a higher return on equity, they would have to spend their money in a way that benefited the grid, consumers. So that was a huge change. Probably as far as CUB is concerned, one of the top line changes in this. And more of the fallout from the ComEd public corruption. The Illinois Commerce Commission is going to investigate ComEd's actions in that and find out whether or not they are liable to ratepayers and see if there's going to be any restitution for ratepayers there. There were a couple of changes. It seems hard to believe that we would have allowed ratepayer recovery for criminal penalties, but we can recover rates for, or recover expenses from consumers for nearly everything, but now criminal penalties are not one of those things. the utilities now are required to hire ethics officers to work internally at the utilities, and then the Illinois Commerce Commission is also going to have an ethics and accountability division to monitor all of this. A couple of things from this for consumers directly, or at least from CUB's perspective, the utility reporting data for arrearages and disconnections and credit and collections activities, that for organizations like CUB, when we have access to that information, it gives us an idea of what's going on in which parts of the state. And it allows us to try to get resources out to those people, get information out to those customers. And then the intervener compensation. So anytime something goes on at the ICC, say there's a docket where things are going to be decided that would impact consumers, it's generally pretty expensive in terms of knowledge cost and in terms of time. So this intervener compensation fund is going to allow, like maybe a community-based consumer advocate, not a CUB or anything like that, to hire an attorney if they need to represent them at the Illinois Commerce Commission. So generally, this opens up a lot of transparency and a lot of input into the processes that guide the utilities. Next slide, please. Some of the consumer benefits, Christina hit on this a little bit. So at the end, or in the Future Energy Jobs Act from 2016, that only dealt with energy efficiency goals up to 2030. And it was pretty clear that that was insufficient. So that was also one of the big changes in this bill, is that those goals that the utilities needed to meet for energy efficiency, reduce the amount of electricity they deliver, have been extended beyond 2030. And after 2042, it's 4-year planning. Every 4 years, those goals kind of get updated. Requiring the utilities to spend more money on energy efficiency programs that target low-income people specifically. And you can see there that it's a pretty significant jump in the funds that are required to spend. So again, stakeholder input on all of this to guide the utilities as to how that money is going to be spent is going to be really important in the coming years. There's an income qualified health and safety fund. So this is probably one of my favorite provisions of the bill. You see a lot of times people want to do energy efficiency retrofits to their home. Maybe the contractor shows up and finds out that there's something wrong with the wiring or corroded pipes or whatever, and the contractor has to stop because it's a safety hazard. And oftentimes that consumer doesn't have the funds available to make those relatively inexpensive fixes so that work can continue. So there will be a fund now that will give people that money so that they can make those like remedial fixes, and then the energy efficiency work can continue. It's also, for the first time, funds set aside now for whole building work rather than just kind of piece by piece. Next slide, please. More consumer benefits. For the first time now, the utilities can count toward their goals, their metrics, building electrification or building decarbonization, as it's sometimes called. And so this is important because as we're transitioning to renewable energy, so we're cleaning up the energy generation sector. And we still have a bit of a problem when it comes to the end use, the individual consumers. And we're seeing more data now that shows that gas appliances are really hazardous to human health. So kind of a next phase in all of this will be decarbonizing those buildings. And that delivers not only health and safety benefits, but it also will make the transition to renewable energy a little bit easier. So the utilities now they're incentivized to help people make those transitions maybe away from a gas range or a gas water heater to electric. Christina also mentioned the building energy stretch code. This is something that was only previously available in Chicago. So for communities that want to go, make above and beyond building codes for like green buildings, more sustainable buildings, the Capital Development Board is tasked with coming up with a statewide stretch code that communities can opt into and set a little more progressive building codes, which again is, as we transition, this is kind of unrelated to the generation sector, as we transition and figure out how are we going to get the rest of the way there for decarbonizing the rest of the economy. Programs like these are going to be really, really critical. And finally, Christina also mentioned the Equitable Energy Upgrade Program. So it's a pay-as-you-save where customers of the investor-owned utilities will be able to finance energy efficiency programs or generation or appliances on their bill, so they can pay that off through their bill, and at the same time they're benefiting from the reduced cost of electricity for, say, an inefficient refrigerator, inefficient home appliances. Next slide, please. So get right into the low-income consumer protection. So a lot of this came from the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when it was clear that shutting people off during that pandemic, or otherwise, I guess, coercing them in hard economic times, was not a good thing for public health. So the Illinois Commerce Commission sat down with the utilities and some consumer advocates and reached a settlement agreement to try to make sure that people weren't feeling coerced or weren't being shut off in the middle of a pandemic. And this resulted in a prohibition of deposits and late payment fees and credit card convenience fees. And what CEJA did was codify all of those. So now it's not in a kind of a non-binding agreement. It's the law for a certain class of customer, for those low-income customers. And another piece of this that is, at least from like the consumer outreach perspective, is program bundling. So, for example, when a consumer goes to their community action agency to enroll in LIHEAP, a lot of times they just, they do just that. They enroll in LIHEAP and they're gone. But now the utilities are going to be working with those consumer or those community action agencies to let consumers know about all of these other programs, these weatherization programs, and even solar for all programs. So all of these things that benefit consumers that they can directly take advantage of. There's going to be a process of figuring out how to streamline and bundle all of that together so that you have somebody who's in need, and their need is not going to stop with some LIHEAP funding. They could probably use quite a bit of other help as well. So this will be a really good, there's a really good program going forward also. And the Illinois Commerce Commission will do a low-income discount rate study. So there's a list, this bulleted list lists some of the considerations that the ICC will make when deciding whether or not a low-income discount rate is necessary. And then the utilities can put that into place. So that was one of the things that was important, not just to CUB, but to a lot of the stakeholders involved, were as we transition, and we talked about a just transition for workers and a just transition for the family of workers and the communities. But we also need to make sure that we're watching over the average consumer who otherwise isn't much involved in the energy economy. Really, we're all involved in the energy economy in one way. And we know that utility burden is is a significant problem for low-income people, where an outsized portion of their income is going to pay their electric bills or their gas bills, and this can provide some kind of relief for them. Next slide, please.
I think that's it, Scott.
Oh, perfect. I made it through. Yeah, so I guess we're done now and happy to take questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. And we do have several questions. If you have others, please put them in the chat. We'll try and get through as many as we can. So our first question, I think, is probably for Andrew. So is there a timeline for the energy transition community grants? When can communities expect to see something, see an application process, get more information?
Yeah, so that isn't there isn't like a statutory timeline in the law. So DCO is going to be implementing this, and we're sort of out on the outside wondering how that's going to go as well. So hopefully we'll be able to figure this process out over the next few months, and the grants can start rolling out. One thing is that the funding isn't there yet. So the funding comes from ratepayers, and I think the charge is authorized starting next year. And so DCO has all these new programs, probably doesn't have funding for new staff yet, and so there's going to be a whole process there. But once that funding starts coming in and they're able to build the programs, we'll hopefully have a lot more clarity on that process. I will say that the one nice component in the bill is that those grants, I think 3% of the grant can be used to cover the costs of a third-party helper in preparing the application. And so there's support for writing those grants for communities that aren't able to handle that themselves because, for example, a coal plant just closed in their community and they've got a lot of other things on their plate. So that will be there, but we don't have the details on the process yet.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Next.
Hello. Today we are talking.
Oops. Next question. Does 100% renewable mean zero nuclear is the goal?
I can take a shot at that as well. The law says 100% renewable in some places. In other places, it says 100% clean. And in that place where it says 100% clean, it later defines clean as 90% carbon free, or 97% carbon. Well, I lost the actual language, but in terms of what were actually the targets that are baked into the law, I believe the renewable portfolio standard target is 2040 at 50%. So I don't think there is necessarily a statutory requirement that really answers this question one way or the other. I think that there are sort of goals stated in the law, but not necessarily like a goals in like the legislative findings, which I don't know if those are binding. I'm not a lawyer. So the answer is we're not sure. I'm not sure, at least.
Fair enough. What measures are in place? This is probably for Scott, I think. What measures are in place to monitor progress, monitor progress and or limit increases in electricity costs, and to ensure resilience and reliability? And who is accountable for that?
Well, in short, it's the Illinois Commerce Commission. So CEJA requires some planning from the utilities. I've mentioned those performance-based metrics. So all of that will be filed with the docketed proceedings at the ICC. Those plans will be filed, and the ICC will be responsible for ensuring that the utilities stick to those plans. Prior to that, there will be public input for public comments and public input on those plans as well. So as the utilities are gearing up to file their plans. So, but yeah, ultimately that still falls to the Illinois Commerce Commission.
All right, thank you. Christina, I have a question that we're hoping you can provide some insight on. How much money is actually going into workforce development? We heard that clean energy job hubs would do and where they would be, but what will they actually look like?
Right, very good question. So we have $80 million per year set aside for these programs. So I think the breakdown was workforce hubs would be managed by the DCEO, and that'll be up to 21 million a year. The Climate Works pre-apprenticeship program is up to 10 million a year and managed by DCEO. The Returning Citizens Clean Jobs Training Program would be coordinated by the Department of Corrections, and that's about 6 million a year. And the workforce or the contractor development and incubator programs, again, managed by DCEO, 21 million a year for the incubator program, 9 million a year for the Primes Contractor Accelerator managed by DCEO. So again, you know, this money isn't where it needs to be yet, and it's, you know, but this is what is laid out in the bill. I hope that answered your question.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Well, just one more point. The locations of the hubs are baked into the law. Just seeing the question in the chat, and they are. Let's see if I can find it real quick. There's 2 in Chicago, 1 on the south side, 1 on the southwest side. Waukegan, Rockford, Aurora, East Alton, East St. Louis,
Carbondale,
Champaign, Decatur, Carbondale,
Danville.
Danville,
Did you say Peoria?
Peoria.
Okay.
Wait, did Peoria?
Excellent. Excellent. Andrew, I think this question is probably for you. Are there probabilistic models on whether Illinois can meet both the climate goals as well as surplus energetic states? Or will it depend primarily on the recs?
I think this goes a bit beyond my experience. I've seen some modeling that shows that we can hit the 2030 goal and still be, you know, have grid reliability. I'm not sure what that speaks to, whether or not we're going to be an importing or exporting state, and specifically out Southern Illinois, whether that section in MISO is going to be importing or exporting. So I'm not 100% sure that I have enough on a model with clear results to answer that question.
Fair enough, thanks. Christina, a question just came in about how will we ensure and monitor equitable clean energy jobs? How will we make sure that really happens?
My understanding that there's going to be an audit done of and reporting that's mandated as well. Does somebody else have better answers to that though than?
Yeah, so the law requires a disparity study in addition to a lot of sort of metrics that were built into the law, and that disparity study will you know, sort of be the chance to really study the workforce, the success of the hubs, but also what the workforce looks like in general, and then that will create opportunities for correction if things aren't going the way that you know, they should be.
Wonderful. And we're going to take one more question and then we'll wrap up. I know we're at time. But for Scott, one of your slides mentioned some kind of accountability board. Can you say a little bit more about how the board will function, who's in charge of it, and how someone could join?
Yeah, it's and I saw Stacy that you asked that, and I think Stacy, if you're familiar with the income qualified groups, the North and South groups, it's essentially the same as that. There's a little more oversight. The ICC is involved with that now, and so involvement will be fairly easy. But I know we're at time. I can follow up with Stacy on that as well.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you so much to all of our presenters today. This was excellent information and I think really useful as we start to understand what this new legislation will mean for the state and what opportunities will be available for our communities. Thank you for all of you who attended. We appreciate your attention and interest. I know we didn't get to all of the questions. The speakers will have the chat, and so we'll try as best we can to get to you if you have other thoughts, or please feel free to reach out to me in Extension or Amanda, Scott, Christina, Andrew, any of us if you want more information. All right, Amanda, do you want to have any final parting words?
Just thanks, and as Lisa said, please feel to reach out. Extension will share our slides with everybody. I think Christina mentioned we're all, excited and willing to start conversations in communities. So if you are a community leader or an organizational leader and want to start a conversation about all of these pieces of the bill or a particular piece of the bill, please reach out. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.